Welcome to Byte-Sized Tech,
Yeah,
where we like to kind of just hang out and chat about tech and gadgets and all those things.
exactly.
But we want to do it in a way that's kind of like
Yeah.
like we're just friends sitting around talking.
Yeah, make it casual.
Yeah. Casual, fun, approachable.
Exactly.
And so today we're going to do a deep dive into some questions
Oh, yeah.
that you guys have sent in.
Done good.
So first up, and this is something I think we can all relate to, is this idea of spending a lot of money on a new AV receiver.
Yeah.
And then finding that the picture quality
Right.
looks worse than when you were just plugging it straight into your TV.
Exactly.
So Jack, a new owner of an LG G4, ran into this exact problem. He's got a new Adonon receiver.
Okay.
Hooked up his cable box, his Amazon Fire TV Cube, even his Blu-ray player. And everything just looked kind of muddy compared to the built-in apps on the TV.
Well, it's interesting because a lot of people don't realize that modern TVs are actually incredibly sophisticated when it comes to video processing.
Yeah.
They have powerful chips and algorithms that are designed to optimize the picture quality.
Right.
And so when you introduce an AV receiver into the mix, it can sometimes add its own layer of processing on top of what the TV's already doing.
Right. And that's not always a good thing.
And that's not always a good thing.
Exactly.
So in Jack's case, what he needs to do is essentially tell his DIN receiver to back off a bit, to just pass the video signal through to the TV without any additional processing.
Exactly. So you want to look in your DIN's menu for a setting called video mode.
Yep. Video mode.
And within that, you're going to look for an option like pass-through or something that basically says turn off all video processing.
Okay.
Now, once you've done that, that's going to ensure that the cleanest possible signal is going from your source devices to the TV, and you're letting the LG do its magic.
Exactly. Let the LG do its thing. Now, there's one more important step, especially if you're using HDR sources.
Okay.
Like that Fire TV Cube you mentioned.
Right.
You need to make sure that your LG G4 is actually set up to receive and display those HDR signals correctly.
Right. So how do we do that?
So on LG TVs, you're typically going to find this setting under Settings, then General, and then there's a setting called HDMI Deep Color.
Okay.
And you need to make sure that's enabled for the specific HDMI port that your DIN receiver is plugged into.
So this is a per port setting.
It is a per port setting.
So even though you might have, your picture settings set up the way you like them on the home screen, you might have to go in and tweak these individual settings.
Absolutely. And it's usually the ERC port.
Okay.
If that's where you have your receiver connected.
Right.
And this is really crucial for getting the full benefit of HDR content. The wider color gamut.
Right.
The increased brightness, all those things that make HDR look so great.
Right. Okay, so that takes care of Jack's question. And it highlights something I think is really important. TVs have gotten so advanced that we really do need to become almost experts in our own right to really optimize them.
It's not just plug and play anymore.
It's not plug and play. Yeah. All right. So moving on to another display dilemma.
Okay.
Diva wrote in about some backlight bleed they're seeing on their brand new Bravia 3 LCD TV.
Okay.
Now, backlight bleed is something that you're more likely to encounter on an LCD TV than, say, an OLED TV, which Duva mentioned they had previously.
Right, and that's because of the fundamental difference in how these two types of displays work.
Right, so with an OLED, each pixel emits its own light. So you have perfect black levels and no backlight bleed.
Exactly.
But with LCDs, you have a backlight that illuminates the entire panel. And sometimes some of that light can kind of leak out around the edges or in the corners.
Yeah, and a little bit of that, especially around the edges, can be considered normal, particularly in darker scenes.
Right.
And especially on more budget-friendly LCD models.
Right.
However, Duva mentioned that they were seeing a significant amount of bleed concentrated in one corner.
Right, and they even sent in a photo, and it was, really noticeable. The top right corner was way brighter than the rest of the screen.
Yeah.
And that kind of localized, intense bleed suggests that there might be a physical issue.
Yeah, it's not just typical LCD behavior at that point.
Right, it's not just oh, this is how LCDs are.
Yeah.
It could be something that happened during shipping, or even during setup, like maybe the panel got bumped or something.
Yeah, something like that.
And so our advice to Duva would be to consider exchanging the TV.
Yeah, I think that's a good idea.
And it also, I think, highlights something important for all of us when we're buying a new TV. Yeah.
Take the time to really inspect it as soon as you get it out of the box.
Absolutely. Even before you mount it or anything like that.
Right.
Just make sure that there's no obvious damage or, weird lighting issues like what Duva is experiencing.
Exactly. All right, shifting gears a bit.
Okay.
We got a question from RB about SDR and HDR content.
Okay.
So they have a new Hisense U8N, which is, a great HDR TV.
Yep.
And they were wondering, do they need to manually switch between SDR and HDR settings when they're switching between different sources?
Well, the good news is that on modern TVs, you generally don't have to do that.
Okay.
The HDMI ports are designed to handle both types of signals.
So they're smart enough to know what's coming in.
Exactly. So when you enable HDR on an HDMI port, the TV is basically saying, okay, I'm ready to accept and display HDR content.
Right.
But it can still display SDR content just fine on that same port.
So it's like it understands both languages. Exactly. Think of it like a bilingual person. They can speak both English and Spanish fluently without having to switch their brain back and forth.
Right. And so for RB, they can just leave their TV set to HDR and it'll handle SDR content automatically.
Exactly. Now, RB did mention an HDR setting, and it's worth pointing out that some TVs have what are called dynamic HDR modes or fake HDR modes.
Right.
And what those do is they try to upscale SDR content to make it look more like HDR.
Right.
Now, whether you like that effect or not is really a matter of personal preference.
Right.
But it is different from the TV just naturally displaying SDR content on an HDR-capable port.
Gotcha. Okay, so that's good news for RB. They don't have to do any manual switching.
No manual switching.
All right, let's talk about physical media for a bit.
Okay, yeah.
Norm from Canada wrote in asking about 4K Blu-ray.
Okay.
So he has an LG C3 OLED.
Nice TV.
Which is, fantastic TV. And he was wondering if it's worth upgrading to a dedicated 4K Blu-ray player.
Okay.
Or if the TV's upscaling of regular Blu-rays will be good enough.
Well, that's a great question.
And he also mentioned that he has a PS5 that he uses for 4K discs.
Okay.
But he doesn't like the fact that it forces game mode when he's watching movies.
Right.
So first of all, I think it's interesting that Sony just released a new 4K Blu-ray player.
Yeah, the UBPX 700K.
Exactly.
Which suggests that physical media isn't dead yet.
Right, like there's still a market for it.
Yeah.
And I think, for people who really care about picture quality, 4K Blu-ray still offers the best possible experience.
Absolutely. And that's because 4K Blu-ray discs have a much higher bit rate and bit depth than what you typically get with streaming.
Right, so it's more information.
More information.
More data.
Exactly. So think of bit rate as the amount of information that's being delivered per second. And bit depth is like the number of color shades that are available.
Okay.
And 4K Blu-ray just has way more of both of those things compared to streaming.
And so what that translates to is a cleaner picture. Better HDR, less color banding.
Exactly. All those things that videophiles really look for.
Right. And in terms of the PS5 forcing game mode,
yeah,
there is a fix for that.
There is. You can go into the settings on your PS5. And under screen video and then video output. There's a setting called ALLM. Which stands for auto low latency mode.
Right.
And that's a feature that's designed for gaming. To reduce input lag. But when you're watching movies, you don't really need that.
Right.
So you can turn that setting off.
Okay.
And that should give you back control over your preferred picture modes.
Oh, that's great.
Yeah.
So that solves that problem for Norm.
Absolutely.
All right, Malik wrote in with a really strange problem.
Okay.
His LG G2 OLED is suddenly refusing to detect video files on his USB drives. But it's still showing folders and pictures.
That's strange.
Yeah, it's really weird.
So the USB drives themselves are probably fine.
Right.
Since you mentioned that his old TV could still read the video files.
Right.
But it seems like something might have happened with a recent firmware or software update on the LG G2.
Okay.
Because sometimes, smart TVs are complex software systems.
Right.
And updates can introduce unexpected glitches.
Right.
Or they can change how the TV recognizes certain file types.
Right. So it could be that the built-in media player is no longer compatible.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It might not support the same codecs or file formats as it did before.
Right.
And the fact that you can see the folders and pictures but not the videos kind of suggests that there might be an issue with the video codec support.
Okay.
or the file recognition in the updated software.
Okay.
So unfortunately, without more specifics about the situation, it's hard to say for sure what the fix is. Right. It might be worth checking LG's support forums or contacting their customer service to see if other people are having the same problem.
Gotcha.
And, it highlights the fact that while smart TVs are very convenient, sometimes relying on those built-in functionalities can be a bit risky because they are subject to these software updates.
Right, which can sometimes break things.
Exactly.
All right, next up, Gabriel is having trouble with his Samsung the Frome TV and his Apple TV 4K.
Okay.
He's trying to use the Apple TV remote to control everything, which is a great feature of HDMI CEC.
Yes, consumer electronics control.
Right, which is supposed to let your devices talk to each other.
Right.
And control each other.
Right, like you can turn everything on and off with one remote.
Exactly.
You could adjust the volume, switch inputs.
It's wonderful when it works.
It is wonderful when it works.
But in Gabriel's case, it's being a little finicky.
Okay.
So he can turn everything off just fine with the Apple TV remote. But when he turns everything back on, the Samsung TV sometimes switches back to its internal source instead of staying on the Apple TV input.
Yeah, that's a classic HDMI CEC problem.
Yeah, so like the devices agree to talk to each other, but then sometimes they just forget what they were talking about.
Yeah, it can be frustrating.
Yeah, it can be frustrating.
And what's interesting is that I've heard that Samsung is actually addressing this in some of their newer 2025 models.
Okay.
They're adding a setting that lets you specifically choose what input you want the TV to start on.
Okay.
So that's good news for future Samsung owners.
Right.
But unfortunately for Gabriel, he's got a 2022 model.
Right.
So he's kind of stuck with this for now.
But there are a couple of things he can try.
Okay, like what?
So in the Samsung settings, under General and then Smart Features, there's a setting called Auto Run Last App.
Okay.
And turning that off might help.
Okay.
He can also look for start screen options, which might be under General or even Privacy.
Okay.
And try turning off Start with Smart Hub Home.
So basically the goal here is to prevent the TV from automatically launching its smart features when you turn it on.
Right.
Because that might be what's causing it to switch away from the Apple TV input.
Right.
So hopefully that'll work. But HDMI CEC can be finicky, so no guarantees.
Yeah, fingers crossed. All right, last but not least, we got a couple of questions about cleaning TV screens.
Okay, yeah.
Which is something that we all need to do, but we need to be careful about how we do it.
Yes, especially with modern TVs.
Yeah. So Christian wrote in asking how to get rid of a fingerprint on his new Samsung S90D OLED. Okay. And Mona, unfortunately, used alcohol on her S90C. After her cat left a little mark on it.
So the first thing to know is that you should never, ever use alcohol or ammonia-based cleaners on a TV screen.
Right. So no Windex.
No Windex, no glass cleaner, none of that stuff. Gotcha.
Because those chemicals can actually damage the anti-reflective coatings that are on these modern screens.
And especially on OLEDs and QD OLEDs.
Especially on those, yeah. And unfortunately, Mona, it sounds like that's what happened in your case.
Yeah.
The alcohol probably stripped away some of that anti-reflective coating.
Right. And that's likely irreversible.
Yeah. There's probably not much you can do to fix that.
So the safest and most effective way to clean a TV screen is to use distilled water and a microfiber cloth.
Exactly.
And you want to make sure it's a high-quality microfiber cloth.
Yeah, low lint.
That's not going to scratch the screen.
Right.
So for something like a fingerprint, you can just breathe on the screen to create a little bit of moisture.
Yeah.
And then gently wipe it away with the cloth.
Exactly.
Now, if you have a really dirty screen, you can spray a little bit of distilled water onto the cloth and then wipe the screen in a circular motion.
Yeah. And again, the key here is to be gentle.
Yeah, don't press too hard.
You don't want to scratch anything.
Right.
And it's also a good idea to let the screen air dry completely before you use it again.
Yeah.
So, yeah, cleaning TV screens is one of those things where simple is best.
Exactly.
Stick to the basics.
Yeah.
Distilled water and a microfiber cloth.
That's all you need.
So we covered a lot of ground today.
We did.
We talked about AV receivers, backlight bleed, SDR, HDR, 4K, Blu-ray, USB drives, HDMI, CEC.
Yeah.
And, of course, cleaning our TV screens.
Absolutely.
So hopefully you guys found this helpful.
Yeah, I hope so, too.
And I think the takeaway here is that technology can be complicated.
It can be.
But it doesn't have to be overwhelming.
Right.
You know, a little bit of knowledge can go a long way.
Absolutely.
And so keep those questions coming.
Yeah, we love hearing from you.
We'll keep doing these deep dives, and hopefully we can all learn a little bit more about how to get the most out of our gadgets.
That's good.
Thanks for tuning in to Byte-Sized Tech.
Yeah. Thanks, everyone.
Don't forget to like, comment, share this with all your techie friends. Subscribe so you don't miss our next episode. And we'll see you next time.
See ya.